Hi, I'm Peter Llewellyn from NetworkPharma TV. This is one of my unscripted conversations, as I like to call them, where I get to chat to folks who I think have something interesting to tell us, something we can learn from. So let's see what we learn today. Today I'm joined by Will Hind, founder and CEO of Alpharmaxim, a healthcare communications agency. And Will, I know you're a passionate advocate of behavioural science, practical applications of in healthcare communication programs and so forth. And the trigger for today was the fact that you published last week a white paper, which I think looked at the barriers to entry to the sort of Parkinson's marketplace. And I'm just interested in all of this because it's a bit of a soapbox for me, but I do think it's important, particularly in comms areas, to think about, why we're doing it. It's not just about how many people sit in a room or how many people click on a website or whatever it is. Okay, so are we doing something that is actually affecting some change? It's sort of an obvious question, but one that often doesn't get asked. And as I say, I know this is a speciality interest of yours. So I'm looking forward to a conversation around that topic, using that white paper as the trigger. But first of all, Will, can you just do me the favour of just explaining to us all who you are, where you are and how you got there?
Sure. So as you said, Peter, I'm the CEO and founder of Alpharmaxim. We started back in 2001. And really, throughout that time, it's been a variety of different evolutions, looking more and more at the sort of marketing, market shaping and peri-launch type activities. And when you start looking at that sort of stuff, you start looking at the pre-launch work that needs to be done and how you're going to measure that and what you're going to do to achieve it, which is really where we started to look at the behavioral science and the psychology of that. If you like, the whole idea of bringing a new drug to market must involve some form of behavior change, right? So that you need to do something different to what's currently being done. And there's a variety of different approaches to actually achieving that. And that's really where we stepped in initially. And then just prior to the pandemic, the P word, we were working with Aston University and started, shortly after the pandemic, the development of what's known as KTP, Knowledge Transfer Partnership, which brings knowledge out of the academic sector into the commercial sector for the benefit of UK firms. It's run by an organisation called Innovate UK, who are part of government. And basically, we won the grant to do that and part fund it ourselves. So we've paid for a lot of research that we've done in conjunction with Aston University School of Psychology, and looked in particular at a specific area of medicine where barriers to change were possibly stronger than in other areas, so that we could form a model and look at something that could be used across healthcare. So
sorry, I'm going to cut across you there. Why did you choose Parkinson's? Yeah.
Two main reasons. One was that we wanted a distinct area where we knew that there would be nothing that would be quite so similar. It wouldn't be sort of interfered with by all sorts of different therapeutic areas. And it needed to be one that was sufficiently enabled that there were specialists who stop, and change therapeutic approaches in it, and numerous enough across Europe so that we could get statistical viability. So it had to be discrete, had to be a discrete area. So rather than it being an area where it was so big that there could be multiple factors, like many of the sort of cardiovascular diseases and things, we wanted a discrete area where we said, right, this is the discrete area, patients are diagnosed, but equally, it's, this type of approach is one that's often used in rare diseases. But if we went to a rare disease, which is a very discrete area, you wouldn't have enough physicians doing the work to actually get the statistical viability.
Okay, and just again, a bit of context here. I know you said you were working with Aston University on this. So I guess my question is, has the topic and the sort of the direction of travel come from Aston and an academic sort of point of view, or from your point of view? Or how does that relationship work? How did it come together and how did it work?
It was our idea, and what we were doing was that we came across contact through LinkedIn on Aston, who were saying, we have this research programs that are available. And they said, oh, we've got a school of psychology. Can we help you anyway? And we noticed that you're doing behavioral change stuff. And at that point, what we did was a belief continuum approach that looked at what's known as a stages of change approach. There's all sorts of models, Peter. I won't bore you with all the psychology around, but this is a stages of change approach. But they said, have you thought about looking at it, other areas of behavioral science and how it impacts on communications in the pharma and biotech sector? And we said, no, tell us more. What sort of research can it be? And that's where we got into partnership with them through Innovate UK.
So in summary, as I understand it, as you say, we don't want to go into too much depth here, but this has been like a 3-year project, hasn't it? I think, and you've published, I think there's 3 papers coming out of it, as well as a white paper that you published last week. So again, just give us some background and some pointers as to where they can find out more information.
Yeah, so they can go to the website and find the link. The website is www.alpharmaxim.com, and on that, there's the front page is where you can find the website link in what we do, etc. But basically, the idea of the research was to look at a way to really drill down into what the barriers are stopping people adopting new therapies in prescribing habit for Parkinson's disease. What would stop a prescriber? So it had to be somebody who would instigate or change therapeutic approaches. What would stop them adopting a new therapy? Why don't they embrace new things as fast as maybe one would like them to do? The sort of basis of this is that if we all think it's logic, right? It should all be about the mode of action and the safety and efficacy of a drug, and therefore, if it's good, everyone adopts it. But the reality of that situation is that no matter how much logic there is, not every patient is on the best therapy possible. We're all somewhat, there's all faults in everything. So we need to try and find why that occurs. And Parkinson's we chose because it seemed that there'd been a lot of overpromise, possibly, by the pharmaceutical industry. There'd also been quite a lot of early hope in certain approaches that never came to anything particularly in clinical terms. And levodopa and dopamine approaches have been around for about 50 years and nothing much has changed. So it seemed like an area that was interesting for us to research. It seemed like an area where there would be some rich psychology pickings. And what we devised with Aston, with our team at Aston, Jason Thomas and Carl Senior, what we wanted to do was find a way of pulling apart those barriers and really validating them. So there was this sort of 3 phases of the research, 2 of which, as you correctly point out, have been published, one in PLOS Medicine and one in BMJ Open, and the third of which is in publication for BMJ.
Okay.
So doing it in 3 different approaches, the first of which was a review, the second of which was a series of focus groups run through an NGT process, and then the third of which was an anonymized survey across the whole of Europe into prescribing physicians in the Parkinson's area. And by doing that, then you can correlate it and you work out what the actual barriers are. You can validate those barriers. Having got the barriers, you can then determine what type of behavior is behind them. If you know what type of behavior is behind them, then you can make probable suggestions as to the best type of activity that will overcome those barriers.
Okay, so obvious question, but having gone through that exercise in this particular marketplace, were you then in a position to start to identify what one should do if you were going to launch the next product into that marketplace?
Yeah, well, the white paper summarizes the combination of the 3 research papers. There were sort of 2 joint objectives of the research, Peter, in essence. The first of which is to look at the barriers and what they are for Parkinson's disease and to help the Parkinson's community. And the second of which was to build a model that looked at something that could be replicated in any disease area. So the papers that have been written are more from a behavioral science perspective, and they have been published so that we can replicate the model in future. The white paper is the thing that actually sets out for Parkinson's. These are the 17 key barriers that you need to know about if you're bringing an asset to market in Parkinson's disease. And the priority that you give to those will depend on what type of asset you have and on more specifics to your asset. But there are 17 key ones that we know are key across Europe for barriers to changing prescribing habit.
Okay, and how far, I mean, I don't know how far we can take this, but I mean, I suppose I'm just sitting here asking the obvious question is, so what next then? What happens? What comes out of this? What do you do? How does the learnings from that exercise feed into practically what you do as a communications exercise?
So what one would hope that people would do is understand that these are key barriers, and that you would then say, actually, this needs to feed into the communication planning part of any brand that's coming forward in Parkinson's disease. And more generally, that actually behavioral science should probably form a more integral part of communication planning processes throughout pharma and biotech. I think pharma and bio have been and are very good at educating, tremendously good at educating, but we're not very good at everything else. And if educating was brilliant, then educating harder would fix everything, but it doesn't. And what we need to do is find alternative things, and you won't be able to understand what those alternative things are unless you actually understand what the proper barriers are that are preventing your asset from being adopted, essentially. So what we do is we work with pharma companies and consult with them to help build better plans that have some roots in behavioral science, and therefore can make sure that they address the true barriers and do them in the right order. In practical terms, what that means is that you will find that there are situations where perhaps people traditionally have talked an awful lot about the MOA or the safety and efficacy of a drug. And the reality is that actually that doesn't matter, because there's another barrier around motivation or around habitual use of something else that people need to overcome before they can talk about how good new drug is. So that it's more about making sure that you understand what the barriers are and doing it in the right order and applying the right type of technique to overcome them. And again, we're really good in pharma at educating people. So educating people about the disease, educating people about the drugs, and educating people about efficacy, mode of action, comparability, et cetera, are tremendous. But what if the prescribers are afraid to use it because of what their peers may think? What if prescribers are actually feeling uncomfortable doing it because they basically got into a habit of using something else? Hence the dopamine argument in Parkinson's. You're so entrenched in dopamine, it's habitual, you use it all the time. It takes a lot to actually overcome that inertia. So there needs then to be different approaches rather than just educating, saying dopamine isn't good enough, you need to do something else. You need to find an alternative approach, and through this type of scientific research and scientific analysis of the barriers, you can then begin to see that there are different types of activity that would be beneficial to help people communicate about, in Parkinson's disease, something that isn't dopamine based.
Okay, and again, being simplistic about it, we've sort of, in an ideal world, perhaps you've applied these principles to the marketplace to identify what the barriers to entry are.
Yep.
And now you're sitting there as a planning team working out what you think you can do to address those barriers. Do you then apply principles to that process to sort of test them out with people before you go ahead and do something?
I think it was always good to test things, right? But in
reality,
the approach that we suggest to people is that, first of all,
right,
if you know what the barriers are, you pull them apart and you understand what type of behavior is driving that barrier, and that is based on. We use the COM-B model, but there are others, and COM-B stands for capability, opportunity, and motivation drives behavior.
Right. Thank you.
And this is something that's been around for about 8 years, I think. And it's developed by UCL, by Professor Susan Michie at UCL. And it's a well-known approach, and it's probably the most up-to-date behavioral science modeling that can be done. Been used fairly extensively in public health and things of that sort. And capability, opportunity, and motivation are the three pillars that you need to address to ensure that you get some behavior change. And by dissecting the types of barriers and learning what type of behaviors they fall into, it then can predict, or when then can look at it to see, well, what are the things that have been proven to be most effective techniques overcoming a motivational barrier. Motivational barriers fit into reflective and automatic. So, there are two types: opportunity, social, and psychology. So you can look at this and actually see what type of barrier it is, and then understand, well, from the 97 behavior change techniques that are seen, there are certain ones which are better aligned at doing certain things. And then you say, so, well, how do we adapt that to the pharma environment, and how do we look at that?
And I still sort of want to then say, okay, you're applying these techniques all the way along, and then you're going to implement a program, and you continue presumably to apply these sorts of principles and measuring and tracking and so on, and reference back and see whether you're actually making the changes you were aiming for.
So again, if you're building a strat plan, right, you have to build it so that you can measure what's going on. So what we would do is at that point we'd say, right, give us your barriers. We'll go away and analyze and come back with some of the typical behavioral components. And we, as part of that, we'll give you then suggestions of the types of activity that you need to do. We'll then work through and build out those into tactics with clients, and the tactics will have some measure of the behavioral change. You have to build in a measure of what behavior change you're seeing. So it's not just about sales. It's not, as you said at the start of this call, it's not just about how many people are in the auditorium or the number of clicks on a website. What is the behavioral change? And that's where you have to sort of work out the entirety of the behavior change, which probably won't happen in one single step. There are probably a multitude of steps. And by working out the little nudges that you need to move along towards the ultimate goal of having product X used universally for Parkinson's disease, you probably need to work out what it is that we need to do to get there, which may usually begin with, how do we destabilize currently what the treatment paradigms are that people are using? But in each of those, by looking at them as a type of barrier, analyzing them, you can then understand, well, this is the type of activity that's most likely to work. Therefore, I'll use this activity and build in a CSF that says whether or not it's going to be achievable. If it's not achievable, then we have to go back and look at it and rewire it, because it's basically hasn't achieved that behavior change that we want to see. And the behavior changes could be, I now think that dopamine isn't the be all and end all of treatment or dopamine creates too many problems because of on-off time, or any of these things might be the starting point for an individual's change in behavior.
Okay, but you sort of identified them at the beginning, and you're tracking them, and you're coming up with some conclusions at the end. It's a long-standing soapbox of mine that we should measure more in medcoms, in and around medcoms, and all that comes with that. The problem, being slightly cynical about it, is from where I sit, often, certainly sometimes, everyone agrees with the principle and the idea, but actually then you start to say, well, actually we haven't got the budget, or it's going to take too long, or it's too difficult, or actually we just want to do this, just get on with it. And let's leave the science and the tracking to one side. And I just wonder what's happening in the real world. I mean,
there's a lot of that. Yeah.
I'm not misrepresenting what happens in the real world, sort of thing.
I don't think so. There's a lot of, I think there's a behavior change that needs to happen within pharma and bio that actually adapts this and uses it. There's it's fair to say there's a degree of reluctance about it, and part of that is possibly because people are habitually ingrained in doing what they've always done. It's fantastic. We've got this fantastic science that's increasingly complex, bringing out miraculous molecules, and gene science. Even today, the lad that was cured of Hunter's disease or Hunter's syndrome was fantastic. It's all gene science stuff. But when you look at this, we're still using rule of thumb and habit to decide what communications to do, particularly in the pre-launch phases of any drug. And you're right, we need to find better ways to measure it. Behavioral science, you can, if you stipulate into it, it's not a huge leap, and it's not a great deal of expense, and it's not a hugely different way of doing things. It just needs to be dovetailed into the approaches one is already taking, and say, well, what is the behavior change we need to see at each of these stages, and how are we going to measure it? And if we then can measure it, then you have something that's able to determine ROI, you can determine the impact that it's having, and you can determine whether or not you carry on or do something different. I think the key thing is that there have been such long ingrained habits that, we talk about omni-channel and we talk about multi-channel, and now we talk endlessly about AI.
Yeah.
The reality of the situation is that AI can help us define and pull apart what types of barriers there are, but somebody needs to have a look at what the behavioral sciences is in the middle that can then define how AI can help us put the omni-channel stuff together at the other end. And this shouldn't be a huge leap. It's not about redefining the way that you do your strategic planning. This is just adding in a degree of ability to measure impact. And, there are companies like us who are out there doing this. We're one of the leaders in the game because of the research that we've done in terms of pulling apart and looking at the types of behavioral challenges. But that's essentially what needs to be done. And then once you've got that, you know what types of activity to do. And all of the CSFs, all of your goals, all of your measurement of impact can then follow out from that. And then you can demonstrate to your boss that you've got ROI.
I totally agree with that. As speaking of someone who's been around, I think you said the agency's been around 20 odd years. Do you think there's been real change in the way that medical communication programs are put together, with increasing emphasis on what is the impact and so on? Do you worry that we're still just seeing how many people we can get into a room? What's your real world experience?
The rooms might be virtual, but the essence is pretty much the same, if I'm honest. I think there's been a good shift towards patient centricity, and that's been tremendously enabled by a lot of the technologies. Multi-channel go through to omni-channel, and I think that patient centricity is certainly at the forefront of a lot of what people want to do. There's been a high desire to actually change things and make things more accountable, and to have measurable CSFs that can be locked into each stage of launch. But then it becomes, well, what can we measure? Well, we can't measure those easily. So what we're going to do is measure the number of bums on seats.
Yeah.
And you think, oh.
Yeah, so exactly.
It isn't a huge challenge. I think with this, what we've done with this model is find an easy way that can relatively simply define and validate the barriers. And then it's a question of look, if you're doing that, you might as well look at what the actual behaviors are within them. If you know the behaviors, you can work out what the types of activity that should be done. And then you can put in place how we're going to measure it. It's not that difficult. This is far from rocket science, and it should enable people to really have a good grasp and a scientific basis to their communications plan.
Which ought to appeal to all of us. As I say, I just keep going back to my real world experience and just going, well, that's fine. People nod their heads, but then they move on, sort of thing, quite quickly.
Yeah, and that's the challenge that I face on a daily basis, Peter. That's where making people realize, and you find that people either think that this is too complex, or that they've kind of tried it in a generic-ish kind of way. They've looked at some of the books and the textbooks around it and have tried it, and it's yielded the same results that they've always thought that they've seen. So they just do the same thing. And if you look at it from an educational perspective, that's what it does. It says education is a key thing in part of driving the C in the COM-B model capability, but it's not the only thing, and you need to work out, and particularly in those rare and difficult to treat diseases, there are other things that are driving both patients and physicians to adopt a new therapy.
Right. Okay. And it makes sense to me. I guess, I don't know, I haven't prepped you up on this, but have you got some sort of tips for people who are interested in learning more about this? Obviously they can go to your website. You said alpharmaxim.com. They can find the papers and so on that you've done. Have you got any useful tips for people that can go off and look at other resources?
Yeah, one of the things, if you want to do it, is to look at the Behavior Change Wheel. It's a book that's published by Susan Michie, or she's the author on it. So go and Google that and find that. So it's a good insight. A lot of the discussion and papers on this were initially started by a chap called Daniel Kahneman, who is a professor. And one of his books is called Thinking Fast and Slow. That's quite a nice one to read through as well. And so some of these things that can inform the background reading would be good for people to understand. I guess, like one of the key things that you and I have sort of talked about in this is the practical application, and there are far too few people who actually are bringing it in a practical sense to the forefront, and that's possibly why there's been this sort of latency of picking it up in the pharma sector. And it's also why there's possibly a degree of resistance, because people can't see the practical implication, or the practical application of it, rather. So it's important that maybe that's one of the key things that's got across. And I think one of the things that I do with others is sort of looking at some of the behavioral science stuff and possibly building an academy to support that.
All right. Okay. And an obvious point is, I can speak for you, can I? And say that if anyone's watching this and wants to know more, they can contact you, and LinkedIn is an easy way to do it. So I'd encourage to point them in your direction. Also, can I put in a quick plug for your new newsletter, or do you want to put in a quick plug for your new newsletter?
New newsletter on LinkedIn and on Substack is called Behavior Changing Communications. You can find it through my LinkedIn profile, or you can go on Substack and just Google the Behavior Changing Communications.
Yeah, no, it's all good stuff. So look, these conversations are all a bit short, and we skip over a lot of grounds. But well, as I say, if people are interested in more information, contact you directly. Look at your LinkedIn pages and your websites and so on. So I'll say thank you very much, and wish you a good day. If anyone's interested in what I'm doing, NetworkPharma TV is the place to go and have a look. But thanks, Will, and good luck. And I hope more people will take notice of these sorts of principles that you're espousing there. So take care, and thank you very much.